Welcome to Talking Business, a podcast produced in Melbourne, Australia. The podcast is available on the Acast site, my own website, the Apple Podcast Store, or wherever you go to get your podcasts. Or you can get it at the Business Acumen website at www.businessacumen.biz or at Banking Day. For the most exclusive access to leading economists and business leaders from around the world, subscribe to Talking Business from my website, leongettler.com. I am Leon Gettler. My job is to review and monitor the week's news in business, finance and economics. I bring it all to you every week. This is episode number 15 in our series for 2024, and today's date is Friday, May the 10th. First, I'll be talking to Future X Collective co-founder Angela Ferguson about the challenges of the hybrid workplace. And I'll talk to RMIT economist Sinclair Davidson about the challenges for Jim Chalmers' next budget. But first, let's talk to Angela Ferguson.
Well, Angela, you've identified 5 different types of workplace individuals now. Tell us about this.
Yeah, well, look, a lot of these workplace typologies were actually around long before COVID, but I think what the pandemic has done is it's made these distinctions much clearer. So the first one we have is that remote worker or, the digital nomad. So that's employees who work primarily from home or another remote location and don't often go into the office. The second one is the office chameleon, which is really the hybrid worker, and we're seeing a lot of that at the moment. So these are workers who split their time between working in the office and working from home or some other remote location. So it's kind of work from the office or work from anywhere, which is, predominantly the model we're seeing people take up at the moment. There's also the wanderlust worker, which is, a deskless worker. So essentially your classic traveling salesperson role. We've got the taskmaster, which is an on-demand worker, and many freelancers will identify with that style of working, and we've seen the rise of a lot of online apps where you can employ people just to do a specific task. And then there's the insight instigator, which is the knowledge worker. So that includes people like software developers, data scientists, and other sorts of researchers that they offer a specific area of expertise to businesses.
And all of that would have come out very much during the pandemic.
Yeah, and as I said, like a lot of those typologies were around, but we're now seeing, like, for example, a lot of my clients prior to COVID, particularly in the professional services sector, would say, oh no, I couldn't possibly work from home, and then once COVID hit and everybody was forced to work from home, we can't get them back to the office now. So, that hybrid working piece and a lot of these others, the opportunity to work in these different ways has really been taken up like never before.
That's interesting. I mean, what does that mean in terms of career planning for people?
Yeah, well, it's actually made things quite challenging because often what we're seeing at the moment is proximity is what gets people the opportunities in a workplace setting. So as an example, in law firms, often the partners will have a brief or, a piece of work that they want to give to somebody. They'll often just kind of put their head up and go, okay, who's around? And, whoever's in close proximity will get that work. But because of hybrid working, people who aren't actually physically there in the office are starting to miss out on that. So, a solution to that is, much better resource management. So, scheduling, planning, allocating people to projects and that sort of thing. But it has created a lot of challenges in that area.
It would create a lot of challenges for managers to actually know who is about where and what they're doing and why they're doing it.
Absolutely. It's like I find that myself, with my team. I want to be able to just sort of put my head up and go, oh, have you got a minute, or can you help me with something? And it'll be the people who are closest to me. But it's much more complicated to have to plan out what you want someone to do, actually document it, then align calendars, and then set a meeting, and then jump on a call. And it can be quite cumbersome.
Which is why a lot of companies are now saying the place for work is the workplace.
Yeah, but I don't know. I think there has to be a better balance in that. It can't just be, oh, it's all too hard, let's just all go back to the office, because there've been a lot of gains over the last few years. So that ability for people to, balance their work life home commitments and live much more fulfilling and engaging lives. Yeah, I don't think we can forget that. So the opportunity is for businesses to sort of leverage the gains, but then find the right balance. So what we're finding now is that a lot of companies, they'll have an overarching hybrid or remote work or post-pandemic policy, and then it's up to the individual teams within the business to start to develop as a team what that looks like.
Right, and how challenging is that?
It's very challenging. Very challenging. But, and I think too, in a lot of ways, we're only at the beginning of what the future of work looks like. We're just now starting to settle into some regular patterns and rhythms of work. And we've been in a test and learn phase for a few years, which I think will continue. But yeah, every company is different. So, and often it's led by culture. So whoever the leadership is and the type of culture that they've built in the organisation, that will start to determine how they develop these, return to work policies.
Are you finding that these issues occur in particular types of companies, or hybrid work issues occur in certain sectors more than others? For example, professional services firms?
Yeah, look, it's everyone. Everyone's grappling with the same issues, and, there's different kind of idiosyncrasies. So, some sectors, for example, do need a lot more privacy and concentration than others. Tech, for example, the tech industry is probably at one end of the scale. Legal, professional services, accounting is probably at the other end of the scale, and then you've got everything in between. But, a lot of our clients are challenged by, three main things, really. How do you get people back to the office in a meaningful way, and not just because it's that command and control piece? How much space do we actually need, given that our office is probably empty on a Monday and a Friday, and, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, we're at capacity. So how do we manage that? And the third thing really is, what does the future of work look like for us? How is it, how do we create this sort of relevant experience for people that's going to be, engaging and, help us win that war for talent?
And you're saying this is very much about the future of work. So COVID has basically introduced us to this new scenario. And even if and when COVID goes, we're still going to be left with this as a result.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, look, a lot of the initiatives were, a lot of the practices and habits and, ways of working that none of them are brand new. They were all around prior to COVID, but what's happened is COVID has accelerated the adoption of them. So, we're living in this really intense time period where we're in the washing machine of everything happening in the future of work.
Okay, and you can see this happening increasingly throughout the workplaces?
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, no one's nailed it yet, I don't think. And even the companies that I think do have a good policy, it's like when you have a baby, right? And you just think you've got them into a routine and then they suddenly go and do something different. It's a bit like that at the moment with work.
Yeah, and so there are no clear rules and you have to improvise as you go along to discover it yourself.
Yeah, definitely. But which is a great opportunity, right? Because businesses can really start to, everything's up for grabs. They can create their own relevant future of work that's going to address the needs of, all the different generations in their business, that's aligned with their culture, that is, supported by, the right technology platform. And, you then actually have the opportunity to become, quite a unique offering for people.
I mean, looking forward, putting your forecaster's hat on, where do you see this heading in, say, 10 years' time?
Well, that's anyone's guess, really, because 10 years is such a long way away.
Okay, five then.
Yeah, so if we say 5 years, look, I think one of the big challenges is how do we manage space better? So often we're seeing that. So if you split, leadership and employees, leadership want people in the office, say 3 or 4 days a week. Employees want to come into the office 2 days a week. So employees do value the office, but the difference is how often is the expectation of us working from the office. So there's conflict there. And then the other conflict is that when people come into the office, they want energy and vibe and buzz, and then they come in and their colleagues aren't there. So they think, well, why did I waste my time, right? So I think in the next 5 years, I would love, and hopefully sooner, I would love to see us fix that problem. So, and and I think there's not just one solution to that. I think there's a few different ways that we can fix that problem, and it's through, booking systems and managing space and, the cultural piece and the technology piece. So I think that's the next big frontier for us to nail,
So the next frontier over the next 5 years will be organisations will have to be more cognizant of how to organise these hybrid workplaces.
Yes, but without making it too rigid and too structured, because it's that organised freedom or organised chaos really is what we're going for.
It means, as you say, it's like having a baby. You just take it as it comes and you just learn from it.
That's right. Roll with the punches, go with the flow.
That's right. And just understand that you're new to this.
Yeah, and look,
yeah.
there's no right answers, but I would, obviously, given what I do, I would recommend you engage professionals to support you through this process, because it is a process, and as much as I hate the word, it is a journey, and business needs to engage the hearts and minds of their people and take them on this journey. I think one of the big challenges we're seeing too is there's so many different generations in the office now, all with quite unique perspectives, and so that's another big thing that business is having to manage as well.
Well, Angela, look, it's been fantastic talking to you.
Thanks,
and thank you so much for your time.
No problem.
And now let's talk to RMIT economist Sinclair Davidson.
Well, Sinclair, we've got a budget coming up on May the 14th, but it's more complicated because the latest Australian inflation figures are higher than expected at 3.6%. And you have economists like Warren Hogan from Judo Bank saying the RBA will raise rates 3 times to 5.1% this year. That will complicate the budget somewhat.
Absolutely, it will. The inflation figures that came in last week were probably a disaster for the government, because over and above the headline figure of being 3.6%, the trimmed mean and the weighted median were much higher than the government's 2 to 3% range. So the trimmed mean was 4% and the weighted median was 4.4%. This is well above the RBA's target rate, and I know Warren Hogan has been saying, 3 times. There are also some economists out there saying, well, the next move should be down. I'm not a fan of that at all. I definitely think the Reserve Bank should be raising rates from the current 4.35%. I think a jump to 5.1% would be a massive move. So obviously they would probably have to bring it in increments, but I can't see anything other than the Reserve Bank having to raise rates. Inflation expectations getting built into the economy are a disastrous outcome for everybody, and the Reserve Bank will have to act.
What's interesting, though, is that the rate hikes don't seem to be working. I mean, the service sector is massive. I mean, the increases there, you got rents, insurance, education, they've all gone massively high.
They have. And as I think I've said to you many times before, the way in which we solve or cure inflation in a modern economy is the medieval equivalent of bloodletting. It is a rough and ready science. Everybody kind of thinks that, the Reserve Bank are precise and got their fingers on the pulse, all that sort of stuff. They face more or less the same information and knowledge problems as everybody else does in the economy, and they are making momentous decisions. Unfortunately, I think they need to make a particular momentous decision that they probably don't want to make, because that will inflict pain upon the economy. But as my very first economics lecturer ever said, that when an economy is in trouble, the solutions are always painful. And solving inflation is a particularly painful solution, which is why, of course, we should never let inflation get out of control in the first place.
I was reading a fascinating article in the Wall Street Journal, and the US has very similar problems with inflation and their economy. And they were saying that maybe we're at a stage now where we can't ever have low rates again.
Look, the last 20 years or so since the 9/11 attacks, 24 years later, we've seen unusually low interest rates around the world. And unfortunately, the vultures are coming home to roost. Now, at every particular point in time, there's been a good story as to why interest rates should drop. So we had those horrific terrorist attacks, and interest rates needed to drop in order to preserve confidence and keep the economy moving. Then we had the GFC, and all of a sudden, interest rates had to drop again to keep the economy moving. We never really recovered from the global financial crisis. Certainly here in Australia, the budget never returned to surplus. Now, we had 9-10 years of a conservative government who sort of preach, fiscal responsibility, but they took a very leisurely approach to fixing the budget. So when COVID hit 4 years ago, we were woefully underprepared in a fiscal sense. And then the government tried, and we weren't alone in this, of course, every government around the world more or less tried to do this. They tried to sort of lock down the economy, to stall the economy, but to prevent people from sort of rioting in the streets and starving and what have you. They had to pump money into the economy in order to keep people buying and all that sort of stuff. And so what happened is as a result of the policy adopted towards COVID, we had strong inflationary pressures coming into the economy. Where I think our RBA made a mistake was they weren't sure if the price increases we were seeing in 21-22 were as a result of inflation or as a result of disrupted supply chains. To be fair, the argument about supply chains was plausible, but in retrospect, they should definitely have started raising interest rates a lot higher, faster and higher than they actually did. Compounding things is that we now have a new first-term government, and it is a left-wing government. And writing in the Australian Financial Review about 18 months ago, Professor Richard Holden of the University of New South Wales made the argument that inflation is a very difficult problem for left-wing governments because the solution to inflation is causing pain on the economy, hiking up interest rates, cutting government spending, which is something which left-wing governments, generally speaking, don't want to do. And of course, compounding it yet again, a first-term government.
That's fascinating in terms of what the budget will present. And I would imagine they would have a whole lot of spending for lower income earners. And also you've got the tax cuts coming in, which will affect inflation as well, because it will pump more money into the economy. But also you've got an issue with the Made in Australia policy, which has been criticised by the Productivity Commission.
Yes. So first of all, I want to say that tax cuts are not necessarily an inflationary problem because the income that is generated from economic activity. So people are keeping more of their own money that they have generated. So it's not new money per se. So I'm less worried about the tax cuts. I am worried about the spending because, of course, we know we've got a government that is inclined to say things like, we need to help people survive rising prices, so we need to give them more money in order to maintain their standard of living. It's the very act of giving them more money to maintain their standards of living which is contributing towards the inflation. So that is the first problem that we have. The second problem that we have is first-term governments always lose seats. Historically, in Australia, lose seats. So, of course, the government wants to spend up a little bit, especially in its own marginal electorates, in order to sandbag those electorates. So there's a spending pressure coming from that. There's a spending pressure coming just from the cost of living crisis. There's a spending pressure coming from the Made in Australia slogan, which the Prime Minister has rolled out. Now, I have to say there are a whole bunch of things that means to a whole bunch of different people. I'm kind of sure that if some people said, well, let's build weapon systems in Australia, there'd be a whole bunch of people saying, oh, national security is very important. And if you said, let's build medical equipment in Australia, there'd be a whole bunch of people say, well, public health is important. If we were to say, let's build windmills in Australia, the environmentalists would say, well, that's very important. So everybody agrees that making something in Australia is important. The challenge is, of course, is that I kind of suspect that many people also think we should reinvigorate our manufacturing base, which is a terrible idea because the Australian population is too small to justify a viable, efficient, at-scale manufacturing base. It is far better that we focus on things that we are really good at, and what we are really good at is agriculture, mining, some advanced manufacturers around medicines and all this sort of stuff. But the most important thing is because we are a primary exporter, Australia is the origin point for a lot of the supply chains around the world. And so what we do is we export goods and services. The services are our legal system, our accounting systems, how those supply chains are actually structured. So that is, we are good at trade and we should stick to being good at trade. We are not so good at making things. And so we shouldn't be doing that. And of course, if you look at our unemployment figures, we have got really good unemployment figures of around about 3%. Now, you and I both remember when Kim Beazley was mocked for saying that the unemployment figure should have a 5 in front of it. Well, now we've got a 3 in front of it. So where are all these people going to come from that we are going to be doing, making stuff all of a sudden? So that is a challenge. But just speaking on that, Australia uses a 3 Ps framework. So productivity, population, and participation in order to think about economic terms. What we are not doing at the moment is thinking in terms of participation, and what we are not doing doing is thinking in terms of productivity. We are allowing population growth to be our primary driver of economic activity and economic growth in Australia. That is a mistake. And unfortunately, I don't see anybody, either in the government or the opposition, more or less addressing that issue.
Well, that's interesting because the higher immigration rate is actually driving up property prices as well, which have gone up the most in 15 years. And that's contributing to inflation. So the question I have to ask you is, what can we expect in this budget?
I think we're going to expect a lot of spin. The days when the budget was serious economic policy documents, I think, are behind us. You know, when we would have a Keating or a Costello or somebody of substance being the treasurer of Australia. We haven't had a substantial treasurer for a long, long time. And unfortunately, they have become more political documents. We will see a lot of propaganda. We'll see a lot of spending. We'll see a lot of targeted spending. I don't think we will see too many cuts. And unfortunately, in addition to interest rate rises, we do actually need to have government spending money far more wisely and government spending less money far more wisely. Unfortunately, over the last 10 years or so, we've also seen a massive expansion in people believing that everything should be done by the federal government. And what that means is the federal government's only skill is to spend money. And unfortunately, the state governments that are very good or should be very good at service delivery are sort of subcontracting it all out to the federal government, or as they are through the NDIS, the state governments are rorting the federal government. Now, that is an astonishing sort of turn of events where just spending more money becomes the solution to every economic problem, when in fact we know that's, we actually need more substantial policies than just, well, we've increased the budget on this or that item.
And Jim Chalmers says we can expect another surplus.
We probably can. Ironically, our budget is back in surplus because fossil fuel prices around the world are very, very high. And this is an industry which the government in the long term wants to shut down. But in the meantime, because of the Ukrainian war and the Middle Eastern war, export prices for Australia's goods, certainly our coal exports, are sky high. So the government that wants to shut down the coal industry is actually profiteering out of that very same coal industry. So the problem is that makes the government's budget look good, but that doesn't really impact people's standard of living here in Australia. If you look at per capita GDP is down for the last few quarters. There's another measure that I'm really liking the look of, which is real gross disposable household income per capita, which is a bit of a mouthful, but I think that gives us a better feel than GDP per capita. That number is down substantially, like to levels we haven't seen in 10 years. Our productivity numbers are down. There are very, very serious economic challenges facing the country. But we don't have any sort of economic political leadership in this space right now.
And indeed, we're in a per capita recession.
We are. And we have been for a long time.
Well, Sinclair, it's always a delight talking to you.
Fantastic.
Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
So what's happening in the news? Well, the Reserve Bank of Australia is very alert to this cost of stubbornly high inflation lingering in the economy, signalling interest rates will need to stay higher for longer and might have to go up to curb price rises. The RBA board kept the cash rate on hold at 4.35% on Tuesday, but added a hawkish tilt to its post-meeting statement, saying it would remain vigilant to upside risks following an acceleration in inflation. Central Bank Governor Michelle Bullock said rate rises were discussed at the board's May meeting, along with the announced pause, but there was no mention of a rate cut, which reflected the bank's updated economic forecasts. The key pressures are the strong jobs market and high petrol prices, which flow through the economy. The latest forecasts also assumed the Albanese government's energy rebates will come to an end in Treasurer Jim Chalmers' third budget next week. Headline inflation is still expected to return to the mid-range of the bank's 2% to 3% target band by mid-2026, but only because the RBA expects interest rates to follow market pricing. Ms Bullock cited sticky services inflation as a possible trigger for further rate rises, and, in a clear sign of how the bank is thinking about the interest rate pathway, revealed what the bank sees as the biggest policy mistake. The decision to leave the cash rate steady was expected by most economists and investors, though the possibility of a surprise rise had been discussed given Australia's stubborn services inflation. The RBA's forecasts do not include any decisions that will be announced in next Tuesday's federal budget, but which will also include Treasury's updated inflation outlook, factoring in any new spending decisions. Treasury's figures will be closely compared with the RBA's updated forecasts, and Labor will be held responsible for any gap that signals the budget will add to inflation and cause interest rates to stay higher for longer. And ratings agencies have put the Victorian government on notice after it revealed state debt would climb to $188 billion in a budget which paused the Melbourne Airport rail project and delivered $400 handouts for families, but failed to drastically cut spending. Premier Jacinta Allen is counting on a growing economy and an interest rate cut later this year, which Treasurer Tim Pallas said he fully expects to see to curb the state's $26 million a day interest bill. The budget came on the same day the Reserve Bank warned rates may have to stay high for longer because of sticky inflation. Mr Pallas delivered a $15.2 billion deficit on Tuesday, with net debt growing from $156 billion next year to $188 billion by 2028, but forecasts an operating surplus of $1.5 billion by 2025-26. S&P Global Ratings analyst Anthony Walker said Victoria, which was downgraded 2 notches in 2020 from AAA to AA to become the worst rated state in Australia, could face another downgrade to AA- if state debt reached 240% of operating revenues, or interest payments reached 10% of those revenues. Tuesday's budget had no new taxes or levies for the first time in several years, although waste and fire levies will increase. The Property Council of Australia slammed the government for the complete absence of budget measures to alleviate the tax burden to get more apartments and townhouses built. Residential landowners are already bracing for the extension of the vacant residential land tax, which will apply to all vacant properties from next year. The deficits are forecast to turn around through a combination of the economy expanding from $609 billion to $748 billion by 2028, and a slowdown in the major project pipeline, including no new money for the $10 billion Melbourne Airport rail link. Also slowed would be the rollout of 30 government childcare centres, 35 mental health centres and 29 school upgrades, and no new money for 3 new hospitals, as previously promised. About 1,400 jobs had been cut of a promised 10% reduction in public services numbers, equal to about 3,000 roles. Victoria's waste levy will increase to $170 per tonne next year from $129, and the fire levy will increase by an estimated average of $35. But there is no major hold-up to pet projects, including the $20 billion North East Link, the $14 billion Metro Tunnel, the $10.2 billion Westgate Tunnel, and the $125 billion suburban rail loop. And the scale of the Bonza collapse has been revealed in court, with almost 60,000 customers affected, and lawyers claiming they would need a stadium to hold the thousands of creditors. A lawyer for the administrators revealed that nearly 60,000 customers have been caught up in the company's collapse. In a hearing in the Federal Court of Australia in Sydney, James Hutton SC told Justice Elizabeth Cheeseman up to 20,000 participants could attend the first creditors meeting on Friday. It is very difficult to see how 20,000 people could ever be accommodated at a physical meeting. That would require a stadium, Mr Hutton said. Mr Hutton said Hall Chadwick had sent emails to the creditors advising them the meeting would be held virtually on Friday, May the 10th. The court heard creditors including 57,933 customers with forward bookings, 323 employees and 120 trade creditors. The revelation comes as emails shows Bonza's backers in the United States were secretly plotting to get the airplanes out and wind this up more than a month before they abruptly seized the airline's aircraft and sent the carrier into receivership on April 30th, leaving thousands of travellers stranded and out of pocket. Emails sent between the airline's Miami headquartered private equity owner 777 Partners, its financier ACAP, and an aircraft lessor known as AIP Capital suggest the companies were coordinating decision-making about Bonza, a low-cost carrier which only began flying early last year. In an email sent on March 22nd, AIP Capital co-founder Jared Ailstock wrote to ACAP Executive Chairman Kenneth King